Trump calling Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas, and like I don't care. Let's file this under distraction. Is she native or not? I don't care. Did she fill out a form or not? I don't care. Does Trump think something or other? I don't care. Did Trump say something stupid? I don't care. But I want to say something about trivializing her heritage, because that's something I do care about. I don't know anything about her heritage or how close she is to it, but I can kind of relate to the idea of knowing you're indigenous but not really knowing exactly what that means. Because you end up with a good deal of the social consequences of racial exclusion. You get pushed out of the group, but without any of the benefits of cultural inclusion, so you don't really get pulled in. For myself, I know that my father's father was a visibly identifiable member of the Cree nation, but I don't know a thing at all about Cree culture. It just wasn't passed down. My grandfather died when I was too young to really understand. I was 10 or something. So I never had those discussions or was even really cognizant of the fact that he was different. I barely remember him, to be honest. But I have seen pictures, and he looked like the fucking Chicago Blackhawks logo, You couldn't miss it if you wanted to. But I just had no concept at the time, for the few years that I knew him. My paternal grandmother is Jewish and Italian, and that's the identity that my father grew up with, mostly Italian. So, my grandfather's last name was French, so he would have been Cree and French and some mixture that's unclear to anyone, but he looked very, very Indian. But I was told I was French or Italian, and those were the two options that I got. It took me some time to figure out the native, and it took me some time to figure out the Jewish after that. When he was young, he looked like Pacino. As he aged, he started to look like Leonard Cohen, and he eventually aged into looking like an elder Chomsky with a bit of weight. Those big glasses. So I grew up eating pasta and being smothered by exorbitant levels of unnecessary oregano and basil. You could smell me down the street. No joke. I digress. Oddly, all my dad was ever able to give me, or all I was ever able to get out of him anyways, is really the same story. That he had no idea. Okay, until he hit his late teens, and even then he was never really cognizant of it or took the time to learn about it. It's like he kind of knew he was indigenous, but didn't know what that meant or know anything about it, right? He grew up in a kind of urban reserve outside of Ottawa called the Ritchie Street Project, which has become one of those areas that successive waves of immigrants moved through, and was largely populated by Somalis last time I checked, although that may become Syrians over the next few years. It's a rough area, a lot of gang violence. In his day, it was all natives, so when he played hockey on the streets, they'd combine by tribe. You'd have this tribe playing against that tribe, and etc. And the kids knew he was indigenous, so they'd ask him what tribe he was from, and he didn't know. The only thing he ever knew was that he was Italian. So you can imagine that that's about all I picked up, too. He spoke French as a first language, and so I picked up a lot of that. But the native aspect is just a black hole, right? Looking back to when I was a kid, I can point to events that occurred that had to do with other people perceiving me as indigenous without having the slightest understanding of what was really happening at the time. I had no self-awareness of it. So people would say stuff about my nose or about, I had slightly darker skin, and like I never understood. I was just confused. I just didn't understand. So, as a consequence of, these people kind of poking fun at me, and I'm not really understanding why, I just became this antisocial misanthrope, convinced the world's full of assholes. And maybe I wasn't wrong. Maybe the world is full of assholes, and maybe there's great justification for being a misanthrope, but a little understanding of my own heritage and the perception of others regarding it may have assisted me in reacting to what was going on around me. Is that really unusual? I don't know. How many Jewish kids go through the same thing, right? That they don't realize they're different. Or they don't realize that other people perceive them as different. How many Finnish kids that, look white, they look in the mirror and they don't see anything different besides maybe their eyes are a little bit different, but other people look at them and they see something completely alien. Italians. As far as I could tell, I looked like everybody else, from what I could see. But the people around me didn't seem to see it that way. That's a big jump to get over when you're 6, 7, 8 years old, right? I, I was just confused. So, I do have a history of racialized exclusion. But I can't tell you anything about the basis of that exclusion, which is frustrating. I'm not a 64th Cree, it's, I believe, a full 8th, but maybe a 16th. Like I say, it's my father's father. And we think my father's father was Cree and French in some mixture, but we're not sure exactly what the mixture was. So would I fill out the form? I would now, and I'd feel okay with it. I wouldn't have for most of my life, though, because I just didn't know. So, you hear these kinds of, attacks on her, like, you might not see it when you first look at her, but, other people might see it. People might have seen it when she was younger. And, it's not, it's not as clear cut as you might think. I think that maybe this is another example of the negative influence of kind of, critical race theory and concepts of white patriarchy and everything. What you see as white privilege may not be seen as white privilege to others. I've been in this argument with a lot of people. I've watched this argument unfold with a lot of people. One of the most brutal arguments I saw about this was these people were both wealthy. Okay, let's start with that. Very wealthy, both of them. One of them was a South Indian. Was like definitely very much upper middle class. He was an advanced student at Ottawa University. Sorry, at Carleton University. And the other one was she's an Egyptian of Turkish background, Turkish Arab background. Also very wealthy. Right, so two immigrants to Canada, both of whom had more money, substantially more money than your average Canadian. One was an advanced student at Ottawa. The other was between degrees at Queen's. So this was Occupy. Who was involved in Occupy? My experience is that a lot of it was very wealthy students, to be honest with you. And so they're having this argument, and it's the guy from India is darker skinned, and he keeps accusing her of having white privilege, and she just can't handle it, and she shouldn't have taken that. This is an Arabic speaker. She was raised Muslim by the time. She wasn't practicing, but there's a lot of hurdles that a female Muslim immigrant faces in our society. And what he saw as white skin, right? He saw light skin, and like I say, she was mostly of Turkish background, which made her. When you're an Egyptian of Turkish background, that actually means that you're like aristocratic, and I'm not going to throw around a lot of names, but I have enough knowledge of the history of the region that I recognize that her last name was not just aristocratic, but deep ruling class, right? She probably was the descendant of a leader in Egypt in the not so distant past. So we're talking very, very upper class, right? But the people around her didn't know that, right? The Indian guy might have known that, at least as well as I did, right? And so his perception of her skin color is buckling up pretty dramatically with her experience. Because when he sees her, he sees a white, a rich white woman. But when people born in Canada of European stock see her, what they saw was a Muslim immigrant, right? And that's a big, you got to be careful with this, because your experiences are not. I mean, that's what the point is supposed to be, is about experiences, right? And experiences are anecdotes, and you can't generalize experiences. You shouldn't, that's an error, right? I experienced this, so therefore people like me. No, that's not rigorous thinking, but at the same time, your individualized experience is valid as it is, right? So, it may strike you as kind of ridiculous for someone that looks pretty white to, check off a box to say they're indigenous, but you don't know what kind of experiences they've had. You don't know how close she might be to the culture, and you don't know what the logic behind clicking the box off is. For me, like I say, I'm pretty white looking on first glance, although it depends on the time of the year. It's getting closer to the summer. I've been inside. I quit smoking, so I've been inside more, so I might not get as dark. But if I was out a lot, I would be like East African dark, right? Or perhaps more accurately, like Native American Cree dark. You can see it in the summer if I get the tan, and I tan. I don't burn. I tan very, very deeply, right? So depending on the time of the year, you might look at me and say, you're white, but that's not how everyone's always interpreted me, and it's not always been my experience, right? So you just got to be careful before you start pointing fingers and calling people names and stuff. It's not. It's not always as binary as you might think it is.